Hello and welcome to another new to stamping video. Today I am going to be teaching you the basics of wet embossing. I say wet embossing because dry embossing is the process of using an embossing folder in a machine. We won't be doing that today. Today we're going to be taking a stamped image and heat setting some embossing powder. So that's what wet embossing is. Let me show you how it works and share some tips with you. So I'll be demonstrating on a slightly darker piece of cardstock, some Pacific Point, with some white embossing powder. I hope that this will show up pretty well on camera. Let's hope. When you're looking at things in person, you don't need tons and tons of contrast to see it, but I wouldn't necessarily want to emboss with white on white. Usually you want a little bit of contrast unless you're doing some other inking techniques, which we're not even going to get into today. We're just discussing the basics. So the first thing I'd like to tell you about, this is the Embossing Buddy. I really like the Embossing Buddy. This has a powder in it. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but it puts the powder onto your cardstock. The purpose of this is to help prevent static cling and that type of thing, because the embossing powder, little itty bits of it like to stick to parts of your cardstock you don't want it to stick to, and once you heat set that, you can't remove it. You have a brief window between when you apply the powder and when you heat set it where you can fix something like that, but once it's heat set, it's done. So it's nice to avoid stray embossing powder, static clinging to things. It really helps keep things smooth and neat. So let's go ahead and use the Embossing Buddy to prepare our cardstock for embossing. Now I have no idea how much of this you can see on camera. Supposedly this camera is HD, but I don't even know what the standards for that are anymore. Hopefully you can see. Now I am only doing this section. I'm really just going to be embossing a sentiment down here. And as long as I dump the embossing powder off this way, there's really no reason to put powder on the entire rest of this. I mean, I could, but it wouldn't benefit me at this point. If you're embossing a large background stamp or something like that, make sure and use the Embossing Buddy all over. Now my second tip, I like to take scrap paper. This is a piece of the grid paper that I've cut in half and then fold it in half. But you know, you could use a bit of printer paper or something like that. I wouldn't go with cardstock. I'd go with something cheap and flimsy. Then I'm going to go ahead and use the Embossing Buddy on this as well. This will help keep this scrap piece of paper clean for us so I can save it and use it again, which I like to do. No reason to drag a new one out every time. Okay, so those things are prepared. It gets pretty quick from here on out. I've got my Versamark ink. This is the ink you will need for embossing because it stays wet and sticky and juicy for longer so that it does not dry before you have a chance to do your embossing. So you just tap your stamp into it. It's clear, but you can see the shine on the stamp, so look for that. Just gonna stamp it down. I do have a separate video on basic stamping techniques, so if you're having trouble inking your stamp or anything like that, you can refer to that video. So we stamp the Versamark in the same basic fashion we would stamp our classic inks. Then you take the powder, you pour it over your sentiment or image, whatever it is. You tap off that excess. Now I don't even have, this time, hardly any stray embossing powder. Worked out really, really well. Sometimes you still get a little bit, even with the Embossing Buddy. So what you do for that, I turn it over and I give the back some good flicks. It seems to work well when the tapping doesn't do it. Okay, I'm gonna set this aside for 1 second just so that I can put my embossing powder away. I like to minimize the risk of spilling it everywhere and losing my embossing powder. This stuff will last forever. You might think, oh, I get this little bitty jar, but I'm telling you, you will use it so much before you even start to see it seem as though it's being used up. So that paper worked great as a funnel. Now we're going to go ahead and emboss. The embossing tool here, this has 2 heat settings, 1 and 2. I'm going to use it on setting 2. About the only time I use setting 1 is if I'm working with something more delicate like a vellum, or if I'm using it just to dry something and I don't want so much heat. So give me just 1 second here to zoom in. I'm attempting to make this as easy for you to see as possible. Okay. Don't know if you could see the detail on the powder or not. Oh, too close, too close. Bear with me, guys. I'm so sorry. All right, so you're gonna hear some noise with the embossing gun. I may end up editing that out, I'm not sure, but I really want you to see what's happening. So before I turn it on and make noise, I'll explain briefly. I will turn the embossing gun on and I will hold it away from my project for a moment so it can heat up. If you take it directly toward the project when it's not warm yet, it takes much longer and it can warp your cardstock more. The warping happens from the heat. So the longer that the heat is on the cardstock, the more likely the paper will warp a bit, which we can fix. It's not the end of the world, but of course it's easier to avoid it completely, right? So let your embossing tool heat up first. It makes things easier. Okay, feels nice and hot. Here we go. That's embossing. I don't know if you can see, I hope you can. Okay, beautiful. Okay, let me zoom out a bit. I hope you saw that. So what happens is you see, when you first put the embossing powder on, you see these little granules of powder. They look very dry. And as they melt, you can see them melt. They become shiny. Looks different. Now, in this case, I did get a decent amount of warping in my cardstock. So one trick I can show you for that, I'm going to turn the heat on and heat it just briefly from the back. And a lot of times that helps fix it. And that did help some. If you're still worried about some warping and you can't seem to fix it with the heat, once this is completely cool, the embossing powder will be set and it won't go anywhere on you. You can put it underneath something heavy in between the pages of a book, something like that if you're really concerned about it. But most of the time, once you stick it down to a project, it'll stick just fine unless it is really severely warped. And the severe warping, usually the quickest way to fix that is with the heat tool from the back of the project. So about the best things I can tell you, don't linger too long. You can eventually burn, warp your cardstock. Just make it, you're not doing any good. Once the embossing powder is melted, it's melted. And continuing to blast it with heat isn't accomplishing anything, at least not anything good. So the second you see that powder melt, you start to move across it. And I hope you saw that as I was embossing. Once it started to melt, you saw me slowly moving across. So luckily our heat tool works very well. It makes it pretty simple. I love the 2 heat settings. So I hope this gives you a great idea how basic wet embossing works. If you have comments or questions, feel free to leave them down below. If you're watching this on YouTube, I would love it if you would come visit my website, stampinonstuff.com, where I have more projects and links to shopping and all kinds of great stuff. I would love it if you'd subscribe to my YouTube channel, or if you're over at my blog, if you'd go ahead and subscribe to my newsletter. Any of those things would be awesome. So thanks so much for your time today. Hope it was helpful. Have a great one.